Hello viewers, today we're talking about when to trade pieces, an important topic that a lot of chess books seem to neglect. In our previous episode, we learned to think about how does a trade affect my ability to control key squares. You should also think about activity when you trade. You should also think about who should initiate the trade. That's what we learned last time. A fourth factor that I'm going to talk about today is who's favored in the endgame. If we trade pieces, we're going to get closer to an endgame, so the endgame should be on your mind. So this comes from my first win against an FM. I was in the 1800s at the time, so it's a pretty big upset. I was playing white and went for the Caro-Kann. And this is a known variation of the Caro-Kann. I don't recommend it for black at all, and that's for a very simple reason. So white can create a passed pawn eventually in the endgame. These guys can create a passed pawn. These guys can't. So 3 against 3 effectively on the king side, so black can't create a passed pawn. So you just trade up all the pieces, white's going to win the endgame. And that's exactly what I did. So in this kind of pawn structure, white has the advantage in the endgame, so trades favor white. Here's another example where I beat a master by knowing when to trade and when to not trade. So I'm playing white in the 2018 Chicago Open, and this game actually took me over the 2100 barrier. So I just played Ricky 1, attacking the queen, and here my opponent made a pretty shocking error of judgment, especially coming from a master, and played queen to a5. So what's going on in this position here is that black has an isolated queen's pawn, which is a reasonably common structure. What the good things are about the isolated queen's pawn is that it gives black a lot of space and activity. In the long run, though, the isolated d-pawn is going to be a weakness. So black has to keep pieces on the board to use his activity, and use it to compensate for the weakness. Queen a5 does not keep pieces on the board. And even worse, after it has to take it, it moves the knight to the rim where it's becoming less active. So black just traded off his most active piece, and now the d-pawn is going to be weaker with no activity to compensate. I won the game just by rounding up this weak pawn. So after the game, I think the first thing he said was that queen a5 was a mistake. So he realized that, in hindsight, trading pieces in this kind of position was not a good idea. The next factor to think about for trades is about the pawns. Are the pawns all on the same side, or are they going to be on both sides of the board? So the side with the advantage usually wants to have pawns on both sides of the board. That way you can stretch the defense. You feint towards one side of the board, and you swing over to the other side of the board, and defense often can't keep up. If all the pawns on the same side of the board, though, then it's a lot easier for a defense to hold. So this is not one of my games. Some of you guys might have actually recognized this is a very famous game, Aljaz and Capablanca, the last game of their World Championship match in 1927. So if this pawn a5, it had been somewhere like, say, e3, black should defend. But as it is, you have pawns on both sides of the board, and we also win in a very instructive manner. Most endgames books will go into greater depth in it and also show you ways that white could have won more efficiently, but I'll just show you what happened in the actual game. So black plays rook a6 to block the pawn, and white defends it. So now white feints an attack on the queen side, forcing black to come over. And now once black has committed himself, he goes to raid the king side. So if black takes the pawn, he's going to trade rooks and go into a winning pawning, so black can't do that right away. Instead, black tries to hold the king side together with his rook. And now white temporarily sacrifices a pawn to shatter black's structure. And now black can't afford a trade because then whereas gobbles with the h5 pawn and pushes his own h-pawn to victory, so black avoids that trade. But now he's going to lose another pawn, and Capablanca resigned. So if you're on the side of the advantage, you want to keep pawns on both sides of the board. If you're the side who's struggling to defend, try to get all the pawns on the same side. So here's a game where I unsuccessfully attempted to apply that principle. So I was playing white. This is in the Washington Open way back in 2007. I was just 1800 at the time. So we know from the point count system that a rook and pawn and bishop and knight are both worth 6 points. In practice, though, the bishop and knight are stronger usually. And I was aware of this at the time and realized that I am the one who's trying to defend this. So in order to defend, it'd be really nice if I could just trade off all these kingside pawns here, and that way I don't have to worry about the queen side. So what I tried doing is king g3 and then f4. The problem with my plan, though, is that I can't actually play g5. If I could play g5, this would all be great, but I can't, so I did not succeed in simplifying my defense. Actually, I made things tougher for myself because now I got to defend over here and also over there, c3 and g4, whereas a few moves ago, I had a more compact issue with trying to defend c3 and also defending f3. Those pawns are closer together. That might have been defensible. I'm not quite sure exactly. But because I unsuccessfully tried to trade off all the pawns on the king side, I actually stretched my own defenses and had to defend g4 instead of defending f3. So I'm playing black against Fritz 5.32, another one of those old computers that have some weaknesses, as we found out earlier. So what I should have done here is played rook c4. And after it takes, rook a4, I round the last pawn on the queen side. So now all the pawns are on the same side of the board. And this would have been a pretty easy draw. I didn't play that. Instead, I played h5. So now there are pawns on both sides of the board, and black should still draw, but it's not quite as straightforward. And in the actual game, I managed to mess up and lose. So if you're a defender, try to trade so that all the pawns on the same side of the board. If you're pressing the advantage, try to keep pawns on both sides of the boards. That should guide your thinking in which trades to seek out and which ones to avoid. So those are a couple more tips on trades. Be sure to tune in for one more episode, and I'll have some more advice for you.